So I've got my clicker here, and I've got my clicker here, and we'll have something in each hand. This will be really fun. So hi, there's still a lot of you here. I'm really happy you stuck around. It's been a really great couple days. It's been a fantastic event. I've met so many new people, had so many great conversations, caught up with old friends. It's been a privilege to be here. So it's a real honor to be moving towards the end here. So what is IPDB? If you're here, you probably know that already. You might be wearing the t-shirt. But essentially, IPDB coordinates a public implementation of BigchainDB. And we do this by setting up a not-for-profit charitable organization made up of a number of member organizations that we call caretakers. So the principle behind all of this is that we don't need to be aliens to the law to do this. We don't have to be running away from the law. We don't need to be living in the dark corners of the dark net. This stuff needs to come into society. We need the tools of law in order to work with society, and we need law to be willing to work with us. So through all of this, we really wanted to put governance and engagement with law first. So yeah, speaking of governance, just slightly over a year ago today, we had our first ever IPDB caretakers meeting at the BigchainDB office. So you've seen some of these people around. You might be able to spot some of them today. So these fine people laid the groundwork for kind of setting up this organization. And at this meeting, we talked about things like what the bylaws should be. Who should be the caretakers? How do we decide what makes a good caretaker organization? What happens if people put on terrible content? How do we deal with these inevitable conflicts between law and society? And the results of that meeting are the articles and the bylaws that are up on the IPDB Foundation website today. So thank you to everyone here. I think it shows that we maybe did something right, that after being locked up with us for 2 days, that most of them came back for another couple days this year. So thank you. So what have we done since then? Since then, we've launched a test network, which currently has over 750 people signed up for developer accounts. We'll be launching a limited production network soon for some of our early users. And we'll be moving along toward a course toward greater decentralization. Tim will tell you a bit about the BigchainDB roadmap a bit later on today, and we'll be following pretty much the same path. We've worked towards setting up a legal organization in Germany, which if anyone has done any charitable work here, you will know that this is a heroic task all on its own. We're working on developing terms of service that are effective everywhere in the world, but understandable enough and not terrifying for the developers who want to use IPDB. We're working to comply with the GDPR, which is coming into effect very, very soon and imposes some really frightening obligations. And I think we could probably have a whole 2-day panel just on GDPR and blockchain. And we should probably do that at some point in the future, but we won't dig into that today. It's too dense and it's too tired at this point in the afternoon. We've also done some work on a pricing model to try and figure out exactly what it costs to do IPDB. Storing all this data forever isn't free. And when you're working with a network like Bitcoin, for example, it's incentivized in order to write the data. But for us, it's not like a web services model, even if it looks like one. You pay once, and if you decide you don't like the service and walk away, we still have to keep storing your data forever because it's immutable. So we have to figure out what data storage will cost upfront going forward forever. And with some of the work that we did this year, we came out to a number with the help of Simon Sherwin and our intern, Jamila Omar, came out to some numbers, and I'll just go through here. To store 1 gigabyte of data on IPDB versus other blockchains. On the Bitcoin blockchain, storing 1 gigabyte would be $22 million. On Ethereum would be $4.6 million. And on IPDB would be 100. Now this is sort of a false comparison because obviously those networks aren't intended for storing vast quantities of data. But for some of the services we've heard people talking about building today, this data storage question is really going to be a major concern. And we're pretty pleased that we've been able to get the price to that point. So all the while we've been doing this, we keep governance in the front of our minds. And really what I want to talk about today is the framework that goes into that thinking. Not any particular one decision, but basically how we get there and the kinds of stuff that we keep in mind. So we're going to get in our internet time machine and go to 1996, because that's where David Holtzman dropped us off in his opening keynote. So he said that we were about in the 1996 stage, that we're still climbing, we're not anywhere near the end of the bubble yet, but things are about to hit mainstream use, and it's about to get really crazy and really exciting. So at that point, we watched, he talked about how we watched domain names go from something that engineers in the basement of the MTV headquarters couldn't convince their parent company that they actually wanted to have, to something that they basically had to bribe the guy to get back. So this is the kind of explosion that can happen over a couple of years, people really waking up to ideas. So 1996, in blockchain land, mass adoption just around the corner. The original internet boom was a really exciting time. I wasn't old enough to build anything really important. I did make a few websites that are definitely long gone and you should not look for because they're definitely gone. But I was old enough to know something important was happening and not to do anything stupid that's still on the internet. And it was really fun to be a part of that. There was just this general feeling that the network society was winning and that internet users were going to be the netizens of this new society. I think that's the last time anyone will ever use that word. And they actually declared independence in 1996. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this here. Governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather. And so it goes on in this kind of language. I declare the global social space we are building naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose upon us. You have no moral right to rule us, and you do not possess any methods of enforcement or have true reason to fear. So we've kind of seen how this falls apart a little bit. And we see how this has turned out. The weary giants kind of woke up from their slumber, and they have definitely caught up. So I see 1996 as two things. It's an inspiration because it's this mark that something really big is happening. And it's flattering to see ourselves as being on the cutting edge of it. And it's really nice to think of ourselves as among the smartest people doing the most innovative stuff, building the most exciting things. But it's also a warning. 1996 had a ton of really smart people too, who felt exactly the same when they were thinking about the big stuff that they were building. And they built the internet that we have decided that we need to fix today. So all the signs were there, and we should have known better then, and we should make sure that we know better now. So this was the first banner ad. This was made by AT&T back in 1994. And by the end of our 1996, we had a company called DoubleClick that was already helping advertisers track clicks, optimize campaigns in the middle of a campaign, do a lot of the practices that we see defined today. And we might not know DoubleClick anymore, but they have been bought by Google, which is doing an even better job of doing all the things that DoubleClick wanted to do in 96. So maybe this 96 comparison isn't quite as flattering as we made it out to be yesterday. So when we're thinking about blockchain governance in 2017, we need to remember that we might not be as smart as we think we are, and we also need to think about exactly what it is we're building. Now we're going to get really trite here. Blockchain is about people. The technological parts are exciting, the tools are powerful, the engineering challenges are huge, but first and foremost, everything we build actually is about people. And it does sound super trite, but I'm going to run with this here, and I think it'll make sense here in a second. So The '96 internet revolution was about connecting people. So like Juan pointed out this morning, there was a ton of infrastructure rolled out during this period. We had fiber going all over the place. We had new networks popping up. We had people getting modems in their homes. Everyone in the world was getting linked together in this really fancy global network, or at least everyone in the Western world was getting linked together in this global network. And it was totally chaotic. So while we're digging out 90s classics, here's another favorite. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But this is important because there was this general attitude that the internet was a frontier. You could be whoever you wanted, you could do whatever you wanted on the net. And there's always money to be made on a frontier. So the next 20 years took that initial infrastructure build out and pushed things much further. So we started to understand the context between people. We developed friends lists and followers. We had dating sites, and it suddenly wasn't weird to me to date online anymore. We started to have real name policies. And so eventually there wasn't a difference at all between the online world and the real world. There was just the world. So now, as we saw earlier as well from Casper's presentation, this thing would have looked totally strange to someone in '96. Today, it makes total sense as a social graph. And now we have blockchain being built on top. So blockchains are really about enforcing the relationships between people or institutions. Now, enforcement sounds really harsh, but I'm not using it in the I am forcing you to do something sense. I'm using it in the sense of we've agreed to do something, and now we are going to do it. So it doesn't have to be harsh. Blockchains just let us set out rules for these interactions with each other, with businesses, with society, and we know that they'll be mathematically enforced. So whether that's about money or identity or voting or new forms of collaboration, we are setting the framework today that will define our interactions with each other, with society, with other organizations, and between all of these things. So just to review, in '96, we had the web with relationships between people. We defined those relationships in the 10 years hence, and then the 10 years since then, we've started building blockchains that actually start to enforce these relationships. So now we know where we have been, we know where we are, but how do we decide where we are going? We need to figure out how we look at the future. So first we need to remember the bubble, and I don't mean this bubble. I mean the bubble that we're all living in that kind of restricts what we see. The bubble that is insulating most of the people in this room from a lot of the harsh realities that are going on for a lot of people just outside. We still feel the impact, but not as much. And we've discussed some of these things the past couple days already, but it's important to review them. I just won't go into too many details. So first, rising inequality. Economists are pretty much in agreement that there's been a stagnation in wages at the low end of the spectrum. And in this room, we can probably agree that automation is going to make that worse and push further and further up the wage spectrum to the point where it's going to be a real issue for a lot of people, probably some people inside the bubble. We've talked a bit about climate change. We can agree that climate change is real, that humans are causing it, and that it's going to be pretty disastrous in the near term. And even if that storm outside yesterday wasn't a direct result, it's something that's going to happen more and more. And another factor to keep in mind, we're going to be looking at like 150 million potential climate refugees in the next 40 years. Political extremism. We've had a huge upsurge in far-right politics across the West. That's been fueled by refugees from various conflicts, some of which might have been caused by climate. That's included Brexit. It's included the rise of AFD here, and probably some other people. I can't really remember who, though. So these trends altogether are pretty dangerous, and they threaten the order that we think we've been building towards over the past 20 years when all of this internet stuff has been happening. But there are also trends that are happening inside our nice bubble that we have to keep in mind. So first is money. There's a lot of it right now. It seems pretty easy for blockchain companies to get cash. And this is really great for building stuff, and there's this boom around ICOs. Some might say boom, some might say bubble. It makes lawyers break into a cold sweat whenever they even hear the letters now. But it does let projects get funded on their own terms, and we'll get these legal issues sorted out, and this is going to be a strategy going forward. But the way the funding is working now, it threatens the ethos of failing fast. And promising projects that look great on paper, but they just aren't working for some reason, these need to be allowed to die really quickly so that people and money and energy and time can go towards other projects. So right now, the ICO level funding really threatens to absorb a lot of people and brain power, and that's a risk for us. Proof of work is a big problem with energy consumption. So the energy used mining Bitcoin increases 5% a month. We've heard, well, maybe that's not such a problem because it offers something real that's being put in to back the currency. But this is closing in on being 0.01% of total world energy production. Like this is not just a little blip. This is a large amount. And keep in mind that's increasing at 5% a month. And it gets even worse because 75% of mining is done in China, and 75% of the electricity in China comes from coal. So this is a really, really destructive thing. When you do the math, that comes out to be a lot of coal. And now if we move away from proof of work, say we think that this is not a great idea, we want to move on to proof of stake or other voting systems or other consensus methodologies. We have to think really hard about this because we get into the problems that we talked about yesterday. You wind up with a plutocracy of whales where you have the people who either bought in a lot at the beginning or built the system or just have a lot of money to buy tokens doing what they like. And then if you go too far to the other side, you have a tyranny of the majority where you have one person, one vote. And we need to really figure out a way to balance these things out. Now, that's not to say that it can't be done. I think that, like I said, there's a lot of smart people in the room. There are a lot of options that we can use. But what it does mean is that we have to think a lot about what systems we choose when we're building these networks. So for certain systems, this might even be a good thing. We might want certain systems where the people who have a lot invested are the ones who get to decide. For other systems, it's not so great. When you start to move down to deciding on how basic services operate or how we elect representatives, these aren't places where we want to have a plutocracy, but we also need a way to deal with this tyranny of the majority question. My little artist rendition when I was thinking of doing everything on Post-its today. So it's also interesting how some of the troubles in our bubble line up and kind of aggravate the problems outside the bubble. So we've got rising inequality that kind of lines up with the mo money problem and the whale plutocracy. We've got climate change that's directly tied to the energy consumption of these networks. We've got political extremism that lines up nicely with tyranny of the majority and the whale issue. We're going to really need to think about, as we move these ideas out into the broader society, both the optics and the realities of doing this. Will these systems that sound so great to us when we are playing with them on our whiteboards seem like a great idea when we move them into society as a whole? And so the other big trend in our bubble is tokenization. So this one is really huge, and it's related to all the other ones. The tokenization of blockchain networks and also moving tokens beyond blockchain networks to the rest of the world. Trent has been doing a series of blog posts on tokenizing bigger and bigger things, and this isn't an unrealistic prospect. So we really need to think about this application of crypto economics. So there's a beauty in the simplicity where you give everyone a piece of the network and they are therefore incentivized to maximize the value of the network. That sounds really nice. But the further you move down the stack, the more you realize it has to be carefully designed. So one risk here is misaligned incentives. So really considering the way that the incentives line up and what will happen to the way the players in the network use their incentive and whether these incentives outweigh the other incentives that they have. So for example, everyone who has Bitcoin has an incentive to increase the value of Bitcoin. But the time frame is different on when people want to realize their incentives here. So users of Bitcoin who want to use it to buy stuff just want high volume. They want to be able to do their transactions quickly. They want to pay small fees. They don't care about the value of the coin itself except as a unit of exchange at the time that they're making their purchase. The holders want to maximize the increase in their value. They see this as the way to blow up the network, but also to increase their own wealth. The miners want short-term stability so they can pay off their electricity and they can pay off their hardware. And all of these people have an incentive in the value of Bitcoin going up, but we see these different time incentives that led to the scaling debate that's just raged over the past 2 years. Another example is ignored incentives, when a certain incentive just doesn't matter to someone. So we can imagine in Trent style, we decide to tokenize the road network outside here. So everyone in the community becomes a stakeholder. We're all going home, so we all get road tokens. If some of us need to get home quicker, we can pay for priority traffic. If we're willing to stay a little bit later and let someone use our space on the road, we might get paid for that. We can vote on where the roads will go. We can vote on how often they'll be cleaned, how they'll be painted, where we'll put up stop signs. Everyone has an incentive to make the system work as smoothly as possible and to build a beautiful transportation network of our dreams. But what about the really rich guy who lives across the street? And he's going to buy up all of our tokens, and he doesn't like traffic at all. He doesn't want anyone driving on our road. He could, in theory, drive up the price of doing this to the point where none of us could actually use this network that we've built. So it's economically totally irrational, but his interests don't line up with the economic interests that we have. His interest is just not having a truck outside. So we need to really think about not just the economic implications, but the other incentives that actors might have. Controversial incentives. There could be stuff that we are encouraged to do that we don't want people to do, where people gaming the system come up with ideas that we might think are pretty repugnant. So imagine a healthcare token, where we allow issuers to incentivize, and it's issued by insurance companies to everyone on their plans, and they do things like, let's encourage healthy eating. We're going to pay people to eat vegetables. We're going to pay people to exercise. We're going to pay people to stop smoking or to drive more slowly. First of all, that requires total surveillance of our lifestyles, and we might be a little creeped out by that. But it could also allow things like allowing rich people to buy the front of the line for healthcare treatment or for organ transplant, or allow the hospital insurance company network to incentivize people to offer blood or to get in line for clinical trials. We need to think about what we are okay with and what we aren't okay with incentivizing. Or back to our transportation network. Once we have self-driving cars, a lot of these transactions will be handled automatically. Our cars will negotiate the cheapest rates. We can say how long we're willing to wait to get home, and maybe our car will find us a discount and make us some money on the way. That would be great, as long as we don't have fancy cars that can prioritize their safety in the event of an accident by paying a bit more. We already have Mercedes saying that their cars will prioritize the people in the vehicle. So what happens when this is just built into the Transportation Network API and anyone at all can decide that they want to pay a bit more to be a bit safer than everyone else? These are choices that we are going to have to make. So it's really fun to be able to quote Hayek in the former head of the DDR, bringing some Austrian economics into East Germany. But he said the curious task of economics is to demonstrate how little men know, or how little, to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. So this is coming back to the first point. We really have to think about how smart we are and move slowly in terms of taking one step at a time and thinking about the incentives that we're building, the models that we're building them on, because these really will be the rails that society runs on for quite some time. Or to put it in the words of the modern cultural critic Kendrick Lamar, we have to be humble. So IPDB is wrestling with these trends. We're trying to navigate the landscape, and we're trying to keep the inside the bubble in mind. We're trying to keep outside the bubble in mind, all the while meeting these regulations and rules that are coming up. And a lot of the discussion seems to be that these rules get in the way, that they're stopping innovation. And it's easy to feel that way when you're working on it and building every day. But really, once this is done, once we have these procedures in place, we've always felt that it's going to work, that we have a stable, safe, secure framework to work in, that we have an interface with the state and with the rule of law, which is a system that's built up over so long and has been really valuable in creating the safe bubble that we live in. And in our efforts to expand that bubble out so it protects more people. So we're trying to keep the lessons of '96 in mind. We're trying to stay humble with the way that we're building today, and it's a huge challenge. And it's easy to feel like the bad trends, that the nasty stuff outside the bubble or the trends that we don't like inside are winning. But days like today and yesterday, where we have all of these people talking about the things that we like to build, it's pretty inspiring. And I think that it's really encouraging to see all of this happening and to realize that the structure we're building is going to be used by so many people to build interesting stuff. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to us. And thank you to our caretakers, who are really the ones who are going to be putting this network together.
Thank you, Greg. I can't imagine you used to be a lawyer. So, anyone has a question for Greg? Here we are in the front, and then one there.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Greg. I wonder, what do you think about the efforts that are being made by IEEE to establish an ethical framework for the use and design of autonomous systems? I think they published their version 1 maybe earlier this year, and a version 2 is coming out. My understanding is that they're essentially crowdsourcing through the use of working groups globally input into what some of the sort of the core values and principles behind the use of AI look like.
I haven't looked at their particular models yet. I think it's really essential that we do start setting out guidelines and building standards for that. I think if we really are building systems that have to make these choices, and I think that having an open society-wide debate about how these systems should behave, what rules should be in place, and what the new ethics are. I think that's critical.
Hey, that was great. Thank you very much. How long is forever? And how does your answer to that question affect the way you're making the decisions you're making? Right.
So I think you're talking about for data storage. Forever is as long as possible. I can't answer what is forever. Forever is a very long time. When we talk about data storage, it's more indefinitely for as long as we practically can. And for the calculations that we've done, what we're trying to do is get sort of an escape velocity for the time value of money. So when you pay your $100 upfront to store data, that will be enough to cover your this year charge, and there will be residue left that we're able to invest and grow over time. And ideally, the thought is that this will carry forward indefinitely, and at that price point, there's an escape velocity. And we've been, you can check out the blog post by Jamila. It's on the IPDB blog. It's very thoroughly detailed, but essentially she was as pessimistic as possible for all of the assumptions about what it will cost to store data, what our overhead will be, the adoption rate for IPDB, all of the different variables. She's tried to be as cranky and unhappy as possible to make sure that we're only pleasantly surprised.
A last question, or real? Yep. You.
You were speaking about incentives and the problems that rich people can basically buy up what they want to have. This is already happening a lot, I think, just not with cryptocurrencies and tokens, but like in the real world. Have you already discussed any systems that could prevent that yet, or are you still in the process with your partners and people who want to join the discussion?
Well, part of the goal for IPDB is to decentralize entirely. I think the legal framework isn't in place for that yet. We would like to operate without having the organization here. In fact, it's built into the mission statement of the organization that it should work toward dissolving. We haven't set any practical steps in place yet, although we will be moving towards tokenized architecture for BigchainDB and IPDB. I think Tim will probably talk a bit about that. And that will kind of enable the next level of discussion. So this is kind of the moving slowly and taking one step at a time. If we know this world is coming, we can prepare for it now and start talking in advance. So this is kind of the beginning of the discussion more than the end.